for you and maybe for you, Bishop Wells. This morning we talked about the lengthy job description in the Constitution. We'll hear more about that, the role of bishop. We saw the lengthy perceptions of the synod in terms of what the needs are and what the expectations are of a bishop, what the gifts that are needed. I also shared in my presentation the very real danger of the maceration of a bishop and a pastor. And so the question I'd raise for the assembly, as you anticipate the possibility of electing a bishop, or for you, dear Brother Martin, who by God's grace is nearing completion of 18 years, is how does one keep one's life whole and centered in Christ in the midst of all of that stuff coming at you? What would you commend, and what is working for you, dear deacons and pastors? And what would you hope might work for the bishop? And dear Martin, what has enabled you to be one who suffers, but also who is a person of hope? Because that's not always the necessary alternative. All right, is there anybody, do we have another microphone? I guess we don't. You'll have to use your big voice in terms of responses. Any responses from the group? Do not be timid. The first one is always the challenge. Yeah.
Well, having experienced a few difficulties in my ministry throughout 17 years, the importance of maintaining a deep life of prayer to just, get you through 24 hours at a time. That, for me, that's the answer. So.
Good, thank you. Yes.
I suspect this is true of the three of you as bishops, but it seems to me that as a pastor, I'm always looking to be discipled by someone who is helping Jesus disciple me. And I would hope that a bishop is finding a way to be constantly in discipleship with someone as their guide in that process. And I think that might be hard to find for bishops, finding people that are willing to take on the task of being a discipler to bishops. But that seems, so I guess I'd kind of like to hear from you, how does that work to find somebody to be a mentor?
Too early. First of all, for you, so you have somebody who kind of functions for you as a discipler.
Multiple people, yeah.
Very good, very good. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that occurred right after I was elected, because I was in the parish, the regional coordinator showed up in my office with a checklist of things I should do. Number 1, have a physical. Number 2, join a health club. Number 3, find a spiritual director. I thought that was an interesting ordering. I think I probably would have said find a spiritual director first. But I found a Roman Catholic sister who kept me grounded. And 2 things I would say. 1, by finding someone outside the tradition, I was able to speak without worrying about whether it was going to come back into the system. That was exceedingly helpful. The other piece was finding a group of clergy who would agree, since we had been in a group for 20 years, and much of what we did was talk about the bishop, that I could participate, but if they needed to talk about the bishop, they would tell me and I wouldn't attend. That would be a form of honesty between the 2 of us, or in that case 6 of us, that we had been honest prior, we would continue to be that. Because one of the shocks to me was upon election, the change of friendships that happened subtly but really. And so having those persons that I could still count on as I had counted on them in the parish was important to identify, but important to identify how that was going to continue and what the boundaries were that I could not cross and that they should not ask me to cross. So having that honesty with colleagues was important. But I would say I had that, I want to call it kitchen cabinet, because we spent more time talking about their issues than mine. But it was an important group, and interestingly enough, my spiritual director was also the convener of that group, and so as a Roman Catholic sister, kept us honest whenever we got too Lutheran.
Yeah, Bishop Wells, what's worked for you?
I'm going to have an opportunity to share some reflections tomorrow evening with Chris, and so I don't want to take too much time from the available scholars tonight. I listened to a set of tapes. They were cassette tapes, and I think there were 7 of them that Tom Soldner gave me soon after I was elected, recorded in Colorado with Rabbi Friedman at a Systems. And I listened through that series of 7 tapes probably at least 15 times in the first 3 years while I was driving. And that proved to be a really, really valuable lesson. I think I said enough about suffering and hope. Yet in my sermon, I hope I did, I meant to. I want to say there's something for genetics. I was raised in a home, a faithful home, where whoever was first out the door to church on Sunday just reached into mom's desk basket and got the offering envelope. It was just sort of in the milk. And I had a father who was an incurable optimist and taught me how lucky I was to have married Susan and how lucky I was to have my mom, and that he believed in me. I have never been one to use a spiritual director. I was tempted by this notion of huddles. Some of you know that language from, I can't even remember, it's an English teacher, an English citizen, teacher, pastor, Mike Green. Yeah, I was tempted by that, went to the introductory workshops over in Issaquah about halfway through my term, but that didn't prove to be too valuable. I think Susan would say I'm fairly isolated emotionally, and I haven't found a safe place to share or to talk on a regular basis other than the friendships made in the Conference of Bishops. I think I've been the luckiest in the world because this amount of time has allowed further study on a whole variety of places of theological necessity and readiness during the consultations around churches leaving after the 2009 votes. I read 3 volumes of Bonhoeffer in preparation for the consultation at First Lutheran in Idaho Falls, and I think I hit it out of the park that night, man. That was really good stuff. So I have been spiritually fed and theologically fed. Oh yeah, they left. We have a new start congregation there now. I think that's all I'd say for now. I'm not terribly proud of that. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but there are different gifts.
Right. And I think there's a sense in which each person does need to find their own cure.
I'm not speaking as a bishop, but just this question made me think of something, not just the life of the bishop, but also life of people in ministry. In Finland, I'm talking about that because I know what's going on there. Every profession, whether you are in counseling or teaching or ministry or leadership, there's something that's I think it's mandated by law that you need to have, it's not called spiritual direction, it's called guiding you in your work. And there's really no English word for that, but it means that you have somebody who is not from your office, but somebody with whom you meet regularly who will help you talk through. It's not psychotherapy and it's not spiritual counseling, but it's more like systems theory based. How are you in your network? And I'm wondering how valuable that would be, even at seminary. For goodness, we really could use that. It's not that we don't love each other and all that, but just to be effective leaders, and because of the original sin, we need help. So maybe this would be some of the growing edges that the bishops could introduce, that this would be mandated, that we all need to have that somebody with whom we meet regularly to talk about our work. And it would be covered by health insurance or something.
Bishop's mandating works really well.
Oh,
I think the things that I would share would be, and I've thought about this a lot over the years, and these aren't in any particular order, but for me it was essential to nurture my relationship with my family, with Heidi, and with the kids. I said as a parish pastor, I'm effective as a pastor to the degree that I nurture my marriage and my family, my children. So it's been important that, and I'm grateful that the kids I've not heard them say that we ever felt that they were second coat to the church. Another would be the daily devotional life. That for me is just, I can't underscore that enough. To be reading the text, the Hebrew writings, the letters, the gospel, the gospel is somebody from the church's history, using prayers from people who, these prayers sometimes move me to tears. I think this person wrote this prayer in 450 AD, and it speaks to my heart. So that quiet time, and that could be 15 minutes, could be 45 minutes, but is absolutely critical. I have used a therapist from Lutheran Social Service, who I first connected with as a parish pastor in Hicksville. We used to joke that she'd seen half the congregation. We worked it out that with her permission and with permission of the clients, we'd actually have permission to talk about their cases that would shape my pastoral responses. But I would not be involved as a therapist. And that worked splendidly in my years as a parish pastor, and then I continued with her. She happens to be a wife of now a retired pastor, and she agreed to meet with me as her gift to the church throughout the years. So about every 6 weeks, she would first check out my sanity. How are you doing? How's your spirit? Then we would do case study situations where I could, run them by her and get a response and just have a partner conversation about that. And at the end of the evening, typically an hour and a half, 2 hours later, she would pray for me. And my kids sent her a thank you note when I retired and a gift saying, we knew that because our dad was visiting with you, we could worry a little less about him. And that's the absolute truth. And then I would also underscore, for me, exercise. And these folks at the Jewish Community Center, many of whom are Jews. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Affiliated now with the YMCA. But one of the senior rabbis in Toledo became a good friend. We talked about the Psalms in the hot tub. At any rate, those conversations of people who are outside our system, some of them are lawyers, these have become great friendships, going to the same place for 20 years. So those, and then I would say a supportive staff. In the middle of 2009, 2010, I was struggling with whether or not to be available for a third term. Actually, I had written a letter to Bishop Hansen that he never received, telling him that I was not intending to be available for a third term, barring a miracle of the Holy Spirit. He didn't learn about that until the Conference of Bishops meeting and said, this is not a good time for election in Ohio. But the staff said one day, well, Bishop, what's your vision for where we go now? And I remember just saying, I have nothing to offer. I have no vision. And they said, how about us planning the next several retreats for the next couple of years? And they literally carried me for, I'd say, a year. By their strength, their vision, their imagination. And I think it was a great gift to the Synod. Once again, something we had to die to create space for some new things to happen. But much of what happened in our new vision for ministry was shaped by the staff and newly emerged leadership from among our deans. It was wonderful. I saw a hand out there. So somebody else had another? Yeah.
This is one of the things that strengthens us. Coming together as pastors. I see people from where I first was. I see people from where I am now. I see people from the area that was my home congregation before I went to seminary. And all of those people feed me. I trust the same and go the other way too, but I come here and I am fed.
Yeah. So the comment is, by being here, she feels that she is being fed.
I want to continue a little bit about the earlier comment that we may not agree on this, but I'm just going to test this out for all of you who are working in ministry. So I work in teaching, so I'm not working as a pastor. My title is not pastor, I'm a teacher, a professor. But it's the same kind of line of work where we deal with people and there are all these emotions and issues, and we bring our own person and baggage into that clouds our theology and best judgment and all that. And I went to counseling during my divorce, and that was one of the best things I ever did. I wish I could have done it. If we all could be like Woody Allen, have psychotherapy every week, that would be amazing. But how would it look like if that really was, I don't want to say a requirement, but something that we were invited as leaders, bishops first, and then the rest of us, to model to everybody else how important it is to take care of our emotional health and mental health and our relationship health and all that. Have you thought about that? And I don't know how many of you use those services that are out there, and are we too busy to do that? And if we don't do that, then what are we modeling for others who feel that there's some kind of shame or failure if you have a conversation partner about your life? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that. In classroom, I give 10 seconds and I'm waiting.
I guess I should stand up so people can hear me. I've had a desire for that many times in my life. But I didn't get a real opportunity to take advantage of coach-type people, you know. I've used some therapy too, but I started seminary at 55. And everybody who knows Ed Preckling knows that they don't do anything the normal way. And I was going to be going to the Interdenominational Theological Center, which was almost all black, which was a big deal for me. And I needed someone who could, a woman who could talk to me and help me to think through my needs. Since I wasn't going to a lockstep seminary that was a Lutheran seminary, only a Lutheran presence in this other place. And as it turned out, that same person became my Greek coach. And over time, her sister, who was also a pastor, became my first call coach. And she ended up marrying the person who became our mentor in starting a new mission. So I've had multiple times when this has been very important. And then, because Mike and I had been called together, we decided that because our time in seminary had introduced us to spiritual practice, spiritual directors, we went together to a group spiritual direction, which became, I was kicking and screaming all the way because I'm not one for group kinds of things, but I found it to be extremely helpful, and that having that moment of quiet where I didn't have to say anything allowed me to get into a deeper thought process and help. I was amazed at what came out of them. So just as an exclamation of what it did for me I strongly recommend something, whether you call it a coach or a mentor or a therapist or a whatever you call them. I think it's important to be able to focus on who you are in this setting. So I strongly encourage what you're talking about.
I'll make one comment, and then I'm going to do my provocative thing to move us in a little different direction. I spoke with my wife Dee Dee this evening, who is with her father in the intensive care unit at Tacoma General after a stroke. And she said, is anyone pointing out to the potential spouses of bishops how many meals they will eat alone in the next 6 years? That it's important that attention be given to what relationship damage can be done by the demands on this office. And that her, I won't say bitterness, but her concern for the church is the toll that we take on spouses of bishops. The spouse network amongst the bishops is excellent. They speak even more glowingly of the spouses of the Conference of Bishops than the Conference of Bishops does about their relationship. But just to, most of you don't know Dee Dee and won't be reporting back to her, so I'm not doing this for credit. I'm just passing this on because of the concern she shared with me this afternoon when I spoke to her, to say, be sure that one of the relationships you tend to is your relationship with your spouse. Because that person is going to eat a lot of meals by themselves. And that will, in many cases, be a whole new experience and a whole new pressure. So I will set that one aside, but note that voice has been demanding to be heard for some time, and so I will speak it. Question, or the provocative thought I had for this evening is, one of the tension... No, I'm not. I'm going to move on to my... Okay.
We need to stay with that a little bit, because I think that we have a chance to change that. It doesn't have to be like, I mean, there will be lonely nights. I mean, I'm a professor. I live across, my husband is in the East Coast, my kids all over. I eat a lot of meals alone by choice, but we're fighting to change that. I think, and I know I have a lot of friends who have been asked to consider the office of bishop, and they say no for family reasons, men and women. And I just think we have a chance here to think about that. That how can we not just accept that that's how it's going to be, but what is necessary separation from your family and what's not. And again, this is not speaking as a bishop. I worked with the church-wide a few years ago, many years ago, actually 18 years ago, oh my goodness, 18 years ago. And I thought that my job, working for the church-wide, many of the aspects of the job were meetings and meetings and meetings where we didn't do a whole lot, but we spent a lot of time meeting. That's okay, but then there's also aspects of the work that I thought I could do home while I have a baby whom I was still nursing. But the structure of the work was such that no, you need to show up at Higgins Road 9 to 5 and do your work here. So that was a male model. So I quit. I said, I'm not going to do that. But I'm just throwing it out there because it's not only for bishops, but also for us pastors. What choices can we make to change the job description so that it's feasible for us to be actually healthy parents and spouses, and yet also be prepared for that loneliness that does come with our calling. That's the cross we bear. So I want to challenge that a little bit. It will be like that, but how can we change that a little bit?
And remember, tomorrow I'm going to do the job description, so now that I've been set up, I'll just move on. I have been the church-wide representative now at 10 synod assemblies when bishops were re-elected or elected. Every one of those has had a number of people say that their primary goal as bishop is to be pastor to the pastors. I will point out tomorrow that the Constitution says the bishop shall provide pastoral care for all the rostered ministers on the territory of the synod and the congregations of the synod. So that the taking one element out of that and saying I'm going to be pastor to the pastors or pastors to the deacons, there's also being pastor to the congregation. So there's a built-in tension in that statement. But I want you to think and ask the question, how can one be a pastor when one also may have to be the prosecuting attorney? Because if there's a discipline charge, it will be the bishop who brings the charges. And is it fair to an individual to say, I'm going to be your pastor, and oh, by the way, I need you to consider what happened here, and I'm not going to be able to give you a pastoral response because the court is going to say, I have to talk to you in a certain way. Are you being fair to yourself and to the synod when you say, my job is to be the pastor to the pastors? Just a provocative thought.
Well, I'll give you up tonight. What do you think? What do you think? What sense do you make of that?
I would agree with what Chris just said. I mean, and I've had.
Voice, stand up.
Sure. I've had great care given to me by what I think our beloved bishop. But there is that built-in tension. You know, when you have to tell your bishop that your marriage has fallen apart, it's not an easy thing to do. And I was fortunate to have Martin as bishop. But I think, Chris, you're absolutely right. I also wanted to thank you before I end up leaving tomorrow morning, but your response last night about the call of being a bishop, I appreciated that greatly. Because I looked at that page and I just went, this is nuts. I mean, if any one of us says that we could do a quarter of those things on it, we're nuts. And we should be disbarred. But to understand the call is huge, that's what we're doing is hugely important. So thank you.
I will say one of the practices, Martin can tell you that prior to the rewrite of the Constitution for the last assembly, I had S1413D of the Synod Constitution memorized. Because I participated, that's where in view of local circumstances, the ministry of the congregation is impaired. The bishop in the company of 2 pastors and 1 layperson shall hear all parties and make recommendation. And it goes on. I participated in 2 of those as a pastor in the Eastern Washington-Idaho Synod because Bob Keller wanted to bring in some hired guns from the West. And so Gib Fjellman and I were the 2 pastors that accompanied him. And then I did 9 of them as bishop in Northwest Washington. In those as bishop, I showed up and said to the pastor, this is going to be a very difficult time for you, and I'm going to be in a position where I can't be your pastor. Who would you like me to ask to be your pastor during this time? You still have the responsibility of providing pastoral care. But if the bishop assumes the bishop is going to do everything in the Constitution and on the wish list that you've identified, you're right, that person is nuts or delusional. It is a question of how do you respond to make sure that the work is done rather than how do I do the work all by myself. Even in a synod that doesn't have the huge staffs like they have back in Ohio. There's always the Region 1 line whenever we got together. You people have staffs, we have to go to work. You know, that was that. But it is a point of how do we manage ourselves, what I do and what I have gifts to do and what I don't and how I ask for help. The election of bishop does not mean you stop asking for help.
Other comments on that one? Kiersey, okay, yeah, please.
Well, I think there's also a responsibility for those of us in the room to allow it to happen. Because very often we would say, if it's not the bishop, then we weren't heard, or we weren't seen, or we weren't felt. And yet he or she may have made provision for that to be done. So there is both a responsibility for the bishop to do that. There's also a responsibility for us to live into that process.
That's very good. I mean, I honestly think you're right on, that the best support we're going to get is from colleagues who in this case are maybe a long way away, but FaceTime connections or other connections that you yourself are always asking yourselves, and together with your spouse and or significant others, how do we find support so that we don't have to wait for the emergency? And it's always nice for the bishop to know that. But in fact, when I would do individual one-on-ones about, 5 or 6 years ago with all the roster leaders, one of my questions was, who's your pastor? And led to many provocative conversations. Kiersey, provocative question. What have you been thinking about? Nothing. I have one for you then. And the group, because there was conversation about the bishop as public voice. So I found myself thinking this afternoon, in my sense, the chief vocation of the church is to be the public voice of the gospel. And my sense is that when people talk about the church in the public square, most often they're thinking about the church's need to engage in social and justice issues. And so somewhere along the line, often the chief vocation, I think, gets lost, or connections aren't made between that chief vocation of proclaiming the gospel and showing the manner in which that vocation feeds into or can bear the fruit of passion for justice, as well as mercy. Anyhow, I find myself wondering about that.
So you're right. So it's easy to think immediately that where the prophetic edge is, it's in the hands-on, feed the poor, eliminate racism, provide equality. That's where we think. That's prophetic. But how about returning to what was one of the first things we heard that the bishops did for us that we still carry with us? What was one of the things that bishops gave us? Witness and martyrdom. But what did the bishops give us? Language about what?
Who is Jesus?
Yeah, language about God, Jesus, explanation. So that was 325 and 381. Some clarification, 431, making Mary Theotokos. Then 451, Christ two natures. Then iconoclastic, and then it stopped. So now it's 2016, and we live in a world where people are not sure they need to be Christians because the Christian worldview doesn't necessarily sound very compelling or sophisticated. People don't know why would they come to Lutheran Church, and they may come for different reasons, but and maybe it's because what my job is, I return to the ultimate task of all of us theologians, and particularly the bishops, to be engaged in ongoing intellectual thinking of the language we use about God, soul, spirit, spirituality, theological language, and not just repeating and describing what was said all those centuries ago, but if the bishops pick up where the early ecumenical councils bishop left it, namely, how do we really talk about God? And they did it, they gave it their best shot. They wanted to engage with the philosophers of the time, and they struggled to find a language that was universal enough and intellectual enough and scientific enough. So how would it look like today if we ask our bishops to get into that and help us to get into that? How would that transform our liturgy? It would be really messy too. But so I'm thinking of that as a part of being the prophetic call of being a bishop, and the theological voice, not just the theological voice for social justice issues, which are as important, I would think, but also to continue the work of help us to make sense with the creedal language, or of the creedal language, in the life we live with the knowledge we have about space, life, humanity. That would be exciting.
Thank you.
One of the things I think we have in our battles around social statements is we've forgotten what they're there to do. Social statements should be teaching documents for the church. They are not canon law. But for bishops and employees of the church-wide organization, public statements are to be grounded in the teaching positions of the church. So while one might say, you can look at the social statement on economics, on peace, on care of creation, and say, that's helpful, I'll teach on that, and it'll provoke some new thoughts. When the bishops go before the legislature or go to Congress, or when the presiding bishop makes a statement, in theory, it's to be grounded in the social teachings of the church. And if we don't have a social teaching, then the implication is the bishop will be silent. That's an interesting place in which we hold each other accountable within this church to what the church has said we can speak on. And at what point does it was interesting when I was in this state, my colleague Bishop Wells and my colleague Bishop Hofstad said, you're in Seattle, you do the public statements and we'll support you. That was an honor, I think. But it was a time when I would go down to Olympia, which was on the territory of the Southwestern Washington Synod, Rob, that it seemed important to me that I was not at that point as a bishop speaking as Chris Berger citizen. I was speaking on behalf of the church. And to do that, I needed to ground myself in the social teachings of the church. And if the church was silent, then I probably ought to be taking that very seriously, whether I should be silent as well. And I did go down and talk on marriage equality, which probably pushed that boundary further than what I just described. But I also was rightfully criticized by members of the synod for going beyond what the church had said. And I think that's the other piece, that when we get involved in these social statement discussions, which in many ways now treats the whole church as the bishops to do the theological thinking, although we don't do it all that well sometimes, that's there. And I think we've spent so much time fighting about those documents, we've forgotten why we have them in the first place and how they're supposed to be used. And I can say in the church-wide offices are used as we put together social position papers or as the bishop considers writing a letter.
I'm mindful maybe a few more minutes, but how about any provocative comments or questions that you want to make for the group? This is your turn. Ah, I see a hand. Stand up in a loud voice.
Yes.
I'm privileged, as many of you know, to be a campus pastor, and so I work with a lot of students who, especially in this area, who claim that they don't have a faith, that they're, they don't believe in God, they don't care about God, and I just had this long conversation with this young man last Wednesday about who God is. And he was so great because he would call me on church words that I would use that I wouldn't even know I was using until he said, I don't know what that means. And I'd say, oh, okay. And then I would have to change it into a different word that resonated with someone who hasn't grown up with the faith. And there are so many millions of people who've never heard, they don't know what salvation means. They don't know what, these words that we sort of have just in us. They don't have any idea. And I think that that's something that for bishops, maybe there's some way to say, how can we describe this amazing faith that we have been given to those who've never heard it? And, are there words that, and sometimes when I would try to change the word and it would sound trite. And I don't want it to sound trite. I want it to sound deep and embodying. And so that's something that I think is something for bishops and pastors to do, is how do we do that without excluding people who just have no idea?
So how are you practitioners of ministry doing that? It's a great question, great comment. How are you doing that? I suspect many of you are and doing it quite well, but tell me, Ron.
For me, it's just, for me, it's just using examples. So if I'm talking about something, and I suspect it's not going to be immediately apparent what all of the freight of that word or words idea is. You just use examples from your own life or from life in general that demonstrate what that means. At least that's how I would do it in a sermon anyway, or a Bible study.
Yeah, please, Paul.
So I have a couple of things to say. I think one thing is, Shelley, you embody the depth and the passion that you're trying to tell. Right? You just did it, and you do it with your students. So that's a really important thing. It isn't always about the words, it's about the incarnation of the faith, and you incarnate faith. So I just want to tell you that. Okay, so one of the ways that we find is really important, and it also has to do with what is the public voice of the church. The public voice of the church is the liturgy. And the liturgy is just absolutely rich with public implication. I mean, worthy is Christ the Lamb who was slain. Christ is always the slain Lamb. And the universe gathers around the throne and the Lamb. That's just how the world is. The universe is. And if we take that seriously, then we look around and we say, where are the slain lambs in the world? Where are the people who are without a home? Where are the people who are without food? Where are the people who are being slaughtered by injustice? If we are the people of God and we are living into the kingdom that is heaven, and heaven is surrounded by the Lamb, what would it look like if our whole life was based on surrounding the lambs who are slain in our world? That's what we're called to. That's our public voice. That's our public ministry. So one of the things we do is when we do catechesis, when we talk about these things, we give people homework. Go home and notice the slain lambs in your neighborhood, in your life, that you don't really notice they're on your periphery. And then ask yourself, what would it be like if your life was actually surrounded, or your community surrounded those people that you now are noticing? Come back and tell us about that. Oh, that's transformative. So I think our public voice has to be our liturgy, and living into that liturgy takes us out into the world of justice and into the world that is broken and desperately in need of that word that we get every Sunday.
This might be oversimplifying it, but I think just eliminating the us and them language ever used is so simply how to connect with anyone who might feel like a lost coin.
Somebody in the back? So hand there? No? Yes.
One of the gifts of the Lutheran Church is that we were called to speak in the language of the people. And I think that relates a lot to what we're talking about with making the story that we have relatable, and even making the liturgy that we have connect. We had a 5-year-old kid that came as a friend, and when he came up for communion, and I handed him the chalice and said, the blood of Christ, he freaked out. Because he took me at my word and thought that we were drinking blood. And so we have to be very aware, if nothing else, that we can't assume that these words are going to be the same thing. So that's part of our job as pastors, all the way around, is to make sure that this gets translated into meaning and not words.
Thank you.
My name is Kimmy, by the way. So you just said what I was going to say, Wes. but it's so one of the ways that I do it is to try to listen to the words that are being used by the people with whom I'm speaking, And it's incumbent upon me to be the translator, because that's part of my work to connect with people and to show up where they are, rather than insist that they come to where I am. So it's to function as a translator.
And more than that, I'm a hospital chaplain, but I think each of us have opportunity to do this, to listen to the emotional piece of what people are coming to us with. And for me, when they're coming with shame, I'm going to talk about the story of Jesus and saying, neither do I condemn you. Or someone who is afraid of God and saying, God changed God's mind. You know, there's such richness in Scripture with the emotional pieces that match up to the same emotional challenges that our people face. And so if we can match those stories, we really connect, but it starts with where they are.
And I hear these comments relating to what I said a few minutes ago. It's kind of a loaded question or invitation to think that, so if we live in a time when our liturgy is beautiful and it is carrying us, and we believe in the power of that, but if the language we use makes no sense without a lot of explanation, don't you think that, especially 2017 coming up, one of the main things for us is to check our language about God, about our faith? I mean, how does it relate to anybody else who did not grow up with our faith? And to check that, then you take a risk. What if you evolve your God language?